Hey, this is Lindsay, and we're getting a little bit back on track. We're trying to finish up the last couple of videos for the 450 shootout where I go through and break down all the bikes individually. If you haven't seen already, we have a main shootout video up. It's about 13 minutes. We cover the ins and outs really quick of each motorcycle, the basic characteristics, and why the bike finished where it did. Now from there, we've been taking it through, going through these longer videos individually about each motorcycle from the test itself and trying to give you guys a little bit more detail on those characteristics, what are good, what about it was bad, and a little more detail from each individual test driver so you can understand how they made those decisions, how the final rankings fell where they did, and be able to give you a little more insight if you're going out there to buy a bike this year, because to say at the top of every shootout, yes, we have a winner. The winner is usually the bike with the most broad balance of attributes. It ranks out the best for the riders when you combine the math, which is very simple. We had 5 test riders. They all rode 3 different days, 3 different tracks, and ranked them 1 through 6. We combine that for the lowest score to pick the winner. But that does not necessarily mean the winning bike is the one that you just absolutely have to go out and buy. There are attributes about it, like I said, we think are very broad, but possibly the 3rd place bike, the 4th place bike, the 5th, the 6th, the 2nd, whichever one it may be, may have the characteristics you're looking for in your next bike. And that's the idea with shootouts. It isn't to be like, well, this bike's last, you shouldn't buy it. No. All 6 dirt bikes are good in their own rights, all 6 of the 2020 450 motocross models we test in this situation we're talking about. It's just down to if those attributes fit you properly. I always hear people go, oh, just buy whatever color you want and get the suspension. And yeah, you're going to end up with a decent dirt bike. As I've experienced with many friends, they're just local guys over the years. They're jumping different brands every year. They find that bike that suits them. They can jump through 3 or 4 different brands over the course of 4 years. And you can see the difference when they hit the bike that suits them, that naturally has the attributes and the characteristics that work with their riding style, or maybe support the areas where they're not as good. And like I said, that's ultimately my goal with shootouts, is always to convey enough information that if that's what you're looking for, you're able to find the best bike off the showroom floor for yourself, or the one that you know is gonna be able to get you to the right places with the right changes. So that's also at the end of this video, I'll go over some of the things we'd recommend changing about the bike actually sitting here. Some of the setup or aftermarket things that I would recommend if you do decide to go out and get, which as you can see me is the 2020 KTM 450 SXF, if you go out to get one of these. Before we jump too far into it, really gotta thank everybody that helped make this happen really quick. Shop Pro Motorsports, where we're able to get all the bikes, privately procure them and go through this like a general consumer would, no loaners from the brands themselves. Tried to take this on a little bit different in that aspect. A couple local companies that helped out, Epoxy at SoCal and DCMX Tools, helped me get a little bit of funding together for this. Look below, description, links to their Instagram. Please give them a follow or shout out. It'd be greatly appreciated. And if you actually need any of their services, also hit them up. Good guys, hardcore moto guys, really down to help the community. Also, Oakley, Specialized Fox set up the guys on gear head to toe. Oakley for goggles, Specialized Sports, everything on this channel. Another thing about Shootout Motorsports, if you need any parts, gear, accessories, shopmoto.com. At checkout, throw in the code ML512 to save a bit off your next purchase. Also, Works Connection, Vista Designs, and Dunlop helped us out. Dunlop hooked us up with a full big batch of fresh MX-33 tires. We didn't have the ability to gain some of the tires that are on these bike stocks, so it was really good to work with what is easily the most common tire on the market the riders use. It is the most popular tire out there for motocross use, so it gives us a nice base system to use, be able to keep fresh, comparable rubber on every single motorcycle in the test. So big thanks to them. So let's jump into this. The KTM, if you haven't, like I said, watched the main video, we do have a result. It finished 5th overall in this year's shootout, and it did that with a 5.53, 5.5 score for 23 points total. So I put 5th overall. As you can see, it's mostly 5th across the board. We do have one low podium rank score for somebody, and we'll go through who each one of those are. But before we get that far, I'm going to give you guys the base attributes of the bike and kind of the little bit longer version of the main shootout result. So start with the basics. Power-wise, this sits about 2nd on the dyno. KTM's used to be top of the charts. Honda took that over last year. KTM still produces really good, strong dyno numbers. And outside of that, it's also the physically lightest bike in the class. Full of fuel, it sits at like 233, 234. Very light bike physically. good power numbers on the dyno. Just a bike that on paper looks really strong, but it kind of has struggled the last couple years. Coming out of their last generation bike, their last generation chassis and bodywork, for most shootouts, they were a top 3 bike, if not a winner. And then in the last 2 years, really, as some of the updates have come on from the OEMs, it's kind of struggled a little bit. And not because, once again, it's not a bad motorcycle. It has some really amazing qualities. It just comes down to, and I'll get into a little bit more about what I think makes it struggle in a shootout scenario. So like I said, let's start about the characteristics. The engine itself, while it does put out big numbers on the dyno, it's interesting how many riders come in and think it feels a bit slow, and it's partially the way the character of the motor is. No 450 is truly slow by any means, but it's kind of the rev character. It's I would like to say when you go from KTM's 250 to 350 to their 450, the power characteristic between them all is fairly similar, how drawn out, how spread it is, and the way it builds power. This doesn't feel like any other any of the Japanese 450s that have a bark and a snap initially. This has much more of a roll and build character, but also kind of a slow rev. So here, you picture a guy on a supercross track come up to a triple on a 450 and just rah. KTMs don't really do that out of the box. They kind of this where they like roll through. They don't really snap to life, and it's hard to say. Once again, people compliment that as there's an aspect to that that's good because it makes the bike easy to ride because it can't get away from you. But there's certain points of the fact of, look, I'm riding a 450 because I want that kind of power. I don't want the bike to feel just like a slightly beefier 350. And that's where I think some of the main contention when I look through the notes for the guys come is it depends on the track we're at. When it's a lot of low throttle inputs, the bike seems very competitive, but when there's tracks where you can just go to open throttle position, it feels like so long to get up and move that it gives riders a poor opinion of it. Some guys say like lap times are good on the bike, it's just not an exciting experience. So when you start to wrap in everything from pure speed on the bike to setup to even the fun factor seems to come in really low on this bike for a lot of guys. They just come off and they're always like questioning like, how much power does it make really? Like, and they just kind of get lost because they know they're not going slow, but they're just like, it just doesn't do what I want it to do. And I've said this a bit the last couple years as well, as riders come in and don't feel that physical lightness as much. And I will admit, I think this is a characteristic of testing on West Coast versus East Coast. Because a few times, opportunities I've gone to ride either a KTM or a Husqvarna on East Coast, when you're in soft material, when you're going through sand rollers, when you're in situations where you can physically work the bike more, I feel like you feel that lighter weight. On West Coast, of course, we are dealing with harder material, less traction overall, and you tend to feel like float more section to section. You're all about carrying a consistent arc. You really can't throw it into as much stuff because the ruts here don't have as much hold maybe. They aren't as overall deep. You don't have as much traction coming in to lean in as early. You don't have as big of, you don't have nice, deep, loamy berms at all tracks. So a lot of times you're doing rolling motions. And at that point, you're not physically working the bike as hard. So the lightness of the bike doesn't stand out as much. The other thing I think that throws that out is engine character can make a bike feel light or heavy. Because it has such a slow rev character, there are situations where you come up to a braking bump or over a roller and you want to use the power to manipulate how the bike works, to basically wheelie or tap off of something or get the rear to squirt out of a corner. Because the power is so slow to respond on this, the bike doesn't always come around using the power, where there's other bikes like the Honda has a huge amount of aggression. The Cowie has a very crisp response initially. And the Cowie doesn't actually have that much total power output compared to the KTM, but it ends up feeling physically lighter in situations because the motor can do part of the work for you, where the KTM, it feels like it's all physical. So once again, we ride some of the tracks out here and the guys come off and they're like, man, I don't notice that physical weight is as much as you would think. Because you think, man, if I'm gonna get on a bike that is 14, 15 pounds lighter than some of the bikes in this test, you think it would be really a massive difference and be so noticeable. And it just isn't always. Like I said, I attribute that to part of the West Coast thing, and I attribute part of that to the power response. So for the last 2 years, we've been talking about that power characteristic, revving slow. And one of the ways I like to explain to people is we see like the KTM race teams cutting open the air boxes. They're trying to get more airflow initially. Think of the motor as a giant vacuum. At low RPMs, it has low suction quality. So you're trying to get air into the air box. It's all sealed up. And if there isn't enough air, the motor really can't respond any quicker because it doesn't have the fuel. And in this sense, air is part of the fuel needed to create combustion. It doesn't have that oxygen it needs. It doesn't have that air quality it needs to really come to life. So a lot of guys end up drilling them out. KTM did do the optional plate, which is on the air side, which we ran in this test quite a bit. Most of the guys preferred it to try to get more air into the motor initially at low RPMs where it's got low suction quality, to try to get it to feel like it responds a little quicker. With the covered air boxes, it revs even a little bit slower. But once this motor's up and moving mid to high RPMs, it's a strong enough vacuum that airflow is getting pulled in through all the gaps of like the subframe, and the little gaps the airbox are getting pulled in well enough it's not as noticeable. It does very well on mid to high RPM. It makes great power up there. It's just that lack of response, and it's such a different character than anything else in the class. This is where I think part of it hurts in a shootout scenario, is it has an adaptation period. The chromoly chassis, the fact that it has an air fork, a little bit different overall bodywork than anybody, plus the motor difference, it has the most adaptation period of any bike when you jump on it. There's a lot of other bikes in class, albeit they all definitely have their own characteristics. There's many others that don't have as much of an adaptation period when you're jumping between them very quickly. Talking about the motor, so this year they did make some changes with the mapping, some stuff with the actual airbox lid. I got to participate in the KTM test this past winter in February, where they did some of these tests. They had a couple media guys outside their normal test staff kind of throw in their comments on this, and it is better. It's still just their range of bikes I consider to be a little bit down on the quality of mapping. They aren't very crisp initially. They don't feel as connected as they should be. They got a little bit better this year, but they've still kind of missed the mark on how well that mapping can be. There's plenty of these bikes that the KTM I run into at all time in the morning. These bikes need to warm up really properly and calibrate properly. If you just start it up, if you've even let warm on the stand for a little bit, if you leave it, come back, start it up, and jump on first lap when it's kind of cold, these bikes will just shut off on first landing. I had it do it to me right at Kihei. I totally forgot to let it, after we'd warmed them all up for photos, and then kind of went and did a few things. I grabbed the bike, I went off the finish line, just jumped around the track for the finish line, hit it, landed in wide open throttle position on the backside, and I almost went over the bars. Definitely something to be aware of with the KTM or the Husky is that the OEM side always tells us there's a bit of a, I want to call it adaptation, but there's a certain system in the bike. When you start it, this bike needs a bit of time to warm up. Don't touch the throttle at all while it's sitting on the sand. It needs to calculate everything and kind of get its stuff together, I guess, might be the most simple term to say. But it's something just to be aware of, and it's part of what I said it comes down to is the guys just don't feel like it has the response or liveliness. So we spent a lot of time talking about the motor, but that really is, on everybody's notes, a big point. Yes, the chassis itself, there's been a good amount of comfort in the chromoly chassis. I wouldn't put them quite on the level right now of like what the Yamaha is or the Cowie, but it's definitely got more chassis comfort than the Honda or Suzuki, mostly towards the back half. Now the front half of the frame is a little bit, I think, where some of the negativity comes in. I think some of the frame updates they did when they went to this generation make the front end feel more precise at times, but it also costed a little bit of comfort mixed in with that air fork where guys struggle with the setup. They come off and don't say necessarily that the bike itself fully feels rigid. I think everybody in the test kind of agrees the back half of the bike has great comfort, great feel and acceleration. A lot of people compliment the shock settings on this bike, the liveliness of them, how well they track, how well they accept and absorb bumps, and how well of a recovery feel they have between chop. The front's just a little bit dead and a little bit hard to set up. Everybody comes out and goes, man, just that whole front area of the bike feels a little bit rigid. And like I said, I don't want to necessarily peg it all to, oh, it's got an air fork, because I actually felt like 2 years ago, the last generation chassis accepted the air fork a little better. When they made the front more rigid, it feels like the front end has less forward to aft give, and it just doesn't follow the ground as well. Mixing that in with kind of the deader feel of an air fork they're kind of in this weird zone where it's like 2 years ago, I was really fine with them having the AR48 fork. I'm definitely not an air fork basher. Some of my favorite forks I had a set of KYB PSF1 kit forks. I still own, I swap around on some Cowies I've had really good settings on. I definitely like some of the attributes of air forks, but even I will admit in this situation, when I've tried this chassis with a spring fork, it is a good improvement, partially due to some of those chassis changes. And what's interesting with the chassis is because it's not, the KTM itself has been going a little bit stiffer, it feels like, the last couple years. They're working on certain things with the suspension setting, yes, to have more initial suppleness, but the overall setting on the KTM felt very stiff and aggressive this year, mixed with a little bit of stiffness at the front of the chassis or rigidity. But then combine that with such a mellow, broad motor, it kind of feels like it has two different, it's like almost two-faced in a sense, like the bike has a lost identity. A lot of riders were confused, you know, as aggressive as the chassis felt. They're like, man, the harder I ride, the chassis, like push the chassis, the better it responds. But they're like, they're kind of confused with that motor to chassis balance. So mostly the concerns with the setup just came from the motor characteristic, which there's only so much you can do. Everybody tries both maps options, all the airbox lids, and it's just what the natural characteristic of the motor is. We really can't get away from that. So if the rider's not favorable of that, that's not much you can do in the score to change it. As for the suspension, like I said, a couple guys were trying a little bit lower air pressure just because there was some overall rigidity at the front. Their factory edition bike honestly felt a little more comfortable at the front end with the different the power part strip clamps they run. Definitely add a little bit of comfort. Going back to a production clamp, coming away from the factory edition bike, has a little bit less comfort in my opinion. And just things like that that make it made it a little difficult for the riders to set up. They just felt like track to track, even though the motor's so mellow, that the bike itself wasn't as comfortable as it could be from track to track, and they really couldn't find an answer for that. Nobody wanted to point complete fingers at like, oh, the forks are junk and saying, they're like, nah, it's just like, I'm just not as comfortable with it as I should be. And ultimately, when we did all 3 days, like I said, the motor depends on the track. If it's a lot of low to mid throttle positions, the guys were okay with it, but on two of the tracks we rode are much more open throttle positions, the motor wasn't that favored. So when it comes down to everybody's scores, I've got to kind of gather all 3 days, and nobody said they were terribly excited with the bike across all 3 days. It wasn't horrible, but there wasn't a day that stood out with it that made it go up the rankings any farther. Like I said, the good characteristics to it are, though, because the motor's so mellow, a lot of guys label it like it can be a very excellent, maybe like vet bike quality if you're somebody that doesn't like the snap and hit of a 450. The motor characteristic on this is like a super beat, like their 350 beefed up. It's really long and drawn out. It doesn't really get away from you at any point. You can ride it aggressively because it doesn't feel like it's going to get away from you. And for guys that like that power characteristic, it's very suiting. Onto the chassis side, it's a unique balance. Like I said, it's not quite the cushion that the Yamaha is, but it still feels more precise than that. It has better turning quality than the Yamaha. Not quite as sharp as the Suzuki or the Honda. It doesn't feel as heavily planted on the front end because it is actually physically quite light on the front due to the air forks. It has quite a bit different weight bias than any of the air bikes in the test realistically. This and the Husqvarna, of course, are like that. A lot of it comes down to that precision, I think, with the frame change at the front. It definitely carves in really well. It holds its line entrance, middle to exit pretty well. But because of the power difference, a few guys commented too that they seem like they just float around the track on this bike. They didn't necessarily get aggressive and square up with power and change lines as often. But if you flow, because the chassis will roll in and be able to carry so much entry speed between kind of a good balance of turning comfort, but not so much planted front end that you deal with the front getting kind of a little bit shaky, a little bit nervous like you will in the Honda or Suzuki. It kind of hits a middle ground that some riders might prefer. So we're gonna get into some of the riders' more exact comments, tell you each what they ranked them individually and give you a little bit of background about the riders. Of course, Jeff Walker was featured heavily in this test. He is like high 160, around 170 pound range, racing nationals this year, 6'1", very lanky guy, a lot of legs and arm, not a lot of torso. He's mostly legs are for that height. He ranked it the highest at third. His goods, he listed part of his goods, the Husky, which is in a separate, different video. But yeah, the motor is smooth. It sticks and ruts well. Even though the motor feels weak, it translated into fast lap times. He did lap time himself every day, and he was putting down good times. Seat is very grippy, a little natural, I don't know how to call them like a rubber insert or what, but the seat is very good on this bike. Accelerates through hard square edge roughness like a breeze, and the bike is very amazing on hard pack surfaces. The bad, low and very stiff handlebars, and overall stiff front end. I could feel a lot of vibration through the bars, which fatigued my arms quite quickly. The weak initial connection of the motor wasn't preferred. Not a tall, rider-friendly bike in stock trim. He felt like the pegs were kind of high and low bars. Like when he was riding a Husky earlier this year, I made him try 5 down, 5 back, 5mm down, 5mm back foot pegs on his bike, and he said it was a huge difference because he feels like right now on this stock KTM Husky, the bars are really low and his knees are kind of up high. So for him at his height, he said it's not extremely comfortable out of the box. At his speed, he said the forks are actually soft. I think for mid-stroke on, he was struggling with them blowing through a bit. And definitely something he said made it hard to ride over the front end and be aggressive. Like I said, I mean, he raced a Husky a little bit earlier this year, but definitely a Honda guy primarily, but those are his notes. Let's see here. Maddox Soto currently rides Suzuki's mid to high 160 pound range, about 5'10". He's like our local B kid, like top 5 B kid here in California. His comments, could not get comfortable with air forks or front end. The front of the frame actually feels a little bit too rigid, not a lot of comfort overall, and hard to ride aggressively. Even though I couldn't get comfortable or didn't have the comfort I was looking for, the bike still turns in great, still has great roll character through middle to exit corner and easy to carry cornering speed. He also said he liked the weight of the bike. He felt like he could feel the physicalness. He's definitely somebody who likes to just throw the bike around as much as possible and rides a little like all over the bike. So he said he did notice the weight a bit. And he also said that the way he grips the bike, he actually likes all the paneling, knee position, the seat feel on the bike. He did ride a KTM for 6 months about a year ago. We have a KTM 250. So he said that overall, a lot of the characteristics of the bike felt familiar with that and was very easy for him to adapt to. He rated the bike 5th. Derek Caskey, he's pretty much like our 40 novice guy in the group. He'll jump about anything. He will directly say not the best cornering speed out there, but he's got great style. Does a lot of suspension testing for vet settings for Enzo Racing. Just an overall pretty smart dude, likes to finick with his bikes a lot. Currently rides Hondas, pretty much has since, oh man, 07, 08. I think that's the only thing he's owned is Honda 450s. If you haven't watched the Honda video, before we get accusations here, I had 3 riders in this test that own Hondas, and only one of them actually picked the Honda for the win. So I felt like the group did a very good job of being unbiased as much as possible. Derek's also like 6'1", 190 pounds, broad shoulders, big hands, big feet, just an overall fairly large-sized guy. Good to kind of comment on ergos for that because he's just generally an overall big guy. He's not a lanky guy like Walker is. He rated 5th, pros for him. Suspension was definitely an improvement over last year, easily noticeable as the lightest bike in the class, and just overall slightly improved mapping characteristics as well, but still room for improvement. Cons, even though it has all the best bells and whistles, there's just a lot of things about this bike that take a while to get used to and really don't cooperate with my riding style. I think part of that is a bit on the motor side. He is somebody that likes a lot of initial grunt, rides very low in the power band, and likes a lot of response, likes to come up to jump faces and seat balance at last minute. The KTM doesn't work with him in that sense. Now, in one side you would say like, well, I kind of think of this as interesting is, like I said, Derek struggles with corner speed. The KTM is very easy for roll feel, but it still doesn't, it's so far away from his natural attributes, even though you would think the bike helps some things he's bad at, it still doesn't support what he likes out of a bike enough to kind of get a favorable result overall. Oh, next one, Zack Petty. Zach's like the shortest guy in the test. I think he's like 5'7", maybe 5'8", 150 pounds. Also a national pro level riders, raced nationals a couple years now, a few years, done a little bit of supercross. Just an overall kind of like compact guy in size. And like I said, he's riding a Honda right now. He raced Yamaha's the year before, and then I think a little bit of Cows and Supercross the year before that. Rated 5th. Motor, this is interesting because he kind of mentions the difference in tracks, and I agree with him very much on this. The motor felt good at Fox Raceway, but it struggled in Kihia, Glen Helen overall, where it just felt slightly flat on power response. So I mentioned on TV you see Fox Raceway with big jumps and stuff, but the way the track lays out, it's not a very easy track to go to wide open throttle position, in my opinion. There's a lot of rollout over an obstacle, and you're always turning off some rollers, so you're just doing these half to quarter to half throttle motions pretty often. You're never full pinned. Kiki and Glen Helen, on the other hand, have a lot of sections where you can just come out and go all the way to the stop on the bike. And then when you're actually trying to get the bike to roll all the way through its power range, like it says, where it feels like it's just taking a while to get through the gears and do anything. Bottom end power wasn't bad on the KTM, but it could definitely use some more overall grunt. Response wasn't what I was looking for. Mid-end power was strong, especially as the RPMs were built. Rear wheel felt planted in, lots of control in mid-range. Top end of the power of the bike felt like it was starving in some maps, especially second map. Yeah, he said just basically for him, he felt like the balance of the power for him at best was in mid-range. Top end, he felt like it was getting a little bit starved when he really tried to rev it out. Felt like he had to short shift a little more than he would want to, and then would struggle though if he went to a taller gear with low end response. So he definitely seemed to be somebody that was trying to find the perfect point in the power and couldn't quite get, you know, the range he wanted out of it. The frame didn't mold to the track or settle like many of the other bikes in this test. Similar to the Honda, it has a very rigid feel in the frame, but not a lot of front end comfort. He actually at his weight said he also was struggling with the shock as well with stiffness. Seat to foot peg height was comfortable for him. Once again, like 5'7", 5'8", so definitely a smaller guy there. He felt like that was good. Even at his height though, he said, I feel like the handlebars are too low and too rigid. They gave me an awkward body position while coming into corners. My body weight was so far up on the front and stayed that way through the corner. I wish I had a slightly taller, more rolled back or more sweep to the bar bend just to center my weight. Brakes were excellent. Fork and shock felt stiff coming to corners, riding very high in the stroke and made it difficult to plant the bike and get it to lean in and roll over. But off big jumps and hits, the suspension seemed to move through the stroke too quickly. Moving on to my comments, man, 5'9", maybe 10 on my best day, probably 9. 160, 62 pounds when we did this test, ride a little bit of everything, pretty much spend, I think, a fairly even amount of times on different bikes for the years. Yeah, still a 5th place on my ranking. And from the standout of the shootout, one of the biggest reasons that stands out for me is that adaptation period. It doesn't, the characteristics of it don't really suit me, it feels like, as easily as a lot of bikes in class. And then the difference between the chassis suspension character and the motor character are so different ways of how I would set up a bike. Like I feel like I can adapt and go about setting up bikes for people where I could go, okay, I'm gonna have an aggressive bike or a soft bike, but it feels like the chassis and suspension on this bike wants to go one character and the motor wants to go to a different type of riding for me, and they don't mold together really well for me. I feel like if you ride this bike only all the time, this specific bike, those characters can start to become well put together, but when just jumping between them, it's just something that doesn't come together that quickly for me. Few things that stand out that are also, you know, a bit of an issue is, once again, that mapping, that connection. It's not very clean on the way it responds, albeit the mapping and the airbox that are better than what they had before for I think engine character. It's still not that cleanly of a mapped bike. I think it still has problems there. One of the things I find interesting in the shootout is, other than my comments about the bike kind of like blubbering when cold and cutting out, is also that response. It's enough different that I always feel like I jump on this bike. I've actually done this the last 2 years of doing shootouts at the Kihia track. Every bike I'll jump on, even it's my first time riding that one for the test, I'll just go out and I'll hit everything. Of course, first lap, we've already done our morning warm-ups. But maybe that first lap's a bit slower. You're rolling up to stuff, messing with your goggles, and just blipping it off jumps. The last minute is a 450, so I'll come up to something on any bike and just blip it. This one always bites me, this or the Husky, because of that motor character. I'll come up to something and go to just seat it and grab a handful at the last second, kind of, and it doesn't do that. It goes and just kind of tractors the power forward, and I end up nosing in and almost crashing. Like, the power characteristic is that much different that I can make that big of a mistake my first lap on the bike if I'm not thinking straight, which apparently I must not be, because I keep doing that. So that's how much difference the engine character is in my mind, that I can make that big of a mistake, because it really just responds that much differently. He said the motor to the suspension just doesn't mesh that well for me. I think the chassis is extremely good on the bike. I just think there's some very simple decisions at the front end that make it feel uncomfortable. The air fork could still be a better setting, or like a lot of guys do, converting to a spring fork. Biggest two though, I would say, is the handlebars and the triple clamps are both rigid. They both cause a weird amount of energy off the front of the bike. The first thing I would probably do to one of these is swap the clamps for the Power Parts KTM item we tested, the split clamps that look like the X-Trigs that they sell themselves. I think they're a little bit cheaper. That is a great item on these bikes, a set of clamps that have more flex at the front and add more comfort, and a different set of handlebars. These production bars, I believe, are made by Neck and Form, and like the stock clamp, it feels so stiff off the front end. It gives it a good amount of input, I guess, but I think it's more than the chassis needs. When they've updated the front of the chassis, as I keep talking about from that last generation, I feel like it made up where some other items up here need to have more comfort in them to balance out that comfort of the chassis, because I really like the back half. I just need more give in the front half, and then suspension settings to kind of match that. Ultimately, I would like a motor that is more responsive. I've tried some just like really well-built aftermarket ECUs that make a huge difference. That motor character is still always going to be there, but there's definitely ways to get more of a connected feel. I don't even mind as much that it is a drawn-out power. I just want the correct amount of response initially. If I'm on a 450, I want to feel like a 450. If I wanted this kind of really reduced feel power down low and that slow rev character, I'll jump on a 350 or something. I ride the 450 because I want to be able to do things that you're kind of only supposed to be able to do on a 450. And it really draws down or brings down the fun factor on this bike for me. Some of the ergos that I wear for my height, yeah, the seat to peg height is really good. Maybe a little compact for bigger guys, good for me. Even admittedly, the handlebars are a little low or maybe a little too far forward. I don't know if the height's bad for me. It's more, I think, how far forward they are. I would run them farther back. The seat profile is a little weird. I don't like a seat that is that rounded at the top. I like one that has a little bit more of a square edge that kind of sit in and hold me, because I feel like on this bike, when I hit a hook and a rut, because the power has a weird mellow response, I'll fall into the hook area a little bit much, and then I'll try to slip under the seat, and it just throws me off balance. It's one of those things that I always feel like that's a bit of an adaptation period for me. Like I said, overall, it's got great weight, or it's got low weight already going for it. I think the biggest expenses are how you deal with the front end, whether it's a fork conversion, really working on some of the hard parts up here to try to get some of that comfort back, then balancing out the bike, and then working on that motor character with ECU and pipe to try to tune in the response you're looking for. There's so many other things it's great with, clutch, brakes, so many other items of the bike I don't think need to be messed with. That's where my main recommendations are. If you do decide to go out and get one this year. Like I said, just not a bad bike, just a bike that seems to have really unusually balanced character, and something that just everybody had a weird time with. Not as much guys came back and go, oh, this is bad, this is bad. They're just like, it just doesn't work for me as is. Like I said, I know probably it getting fifth this year is one of the biggest shockers of our shootout. I'm sure there's KTM likers that aren't stoked on that, but that's what we're trying to convey, is the most honest opinion of like, look, it just out of the box didn't suit a lot of these guys. It might be a bit of an adaptation character. It's definitely one of the bikes that, even though it ranks slow, that's where I say, like, look very carefully at what we're saying with the character. I think there is a lot of people that would like this bike. I think there's a lot of people that can use the good attributes of it if they can fix a couple things. And then there are some of us, like a Fios Tessa, this thing just straight up is not going to suit properly. And that's why I say shootout can be important. This could be an absolutely excellent bike for one guy, and it might not work for another. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed this. Trying to do a really good job of breaking down these attributes. We spent enough time on shootout. Hopefully we give you guys enough info if you're gonna make an informed decision. Like I said, check out some of the sponsored brands I mentioned. The description's below for the links. There's plenty more of these shootout videos up with more depth on each motorcycle, and please hit subscribe. We're gonna try to do this again for 250s. We're working on it. It's definitely not a cheap process trying to get rid of some of these motorcycles. If you would like to support what I do here, patreon.com/ML512. There's also a link in the description. I'm giving away a bunch of prizes every month for a couple dollars. If you have the means to throw in a few bucks, cool. If you don't, just give us a like and a subscribe. That really helps out as well.